All right, stream is up and the recording is on. All right, welcome everyone. Again, it's Rodin, followed by Caleb and Noizy Gamer. We're here to do Naked Trading in Albion, episode 5. All right, we've been really good with keeping with our every 2-week schedule. So again, it's Rodin, and haven't done much in game. Mostly just been working on my islands mostly, and figuring out some numbers to place into spreadsheets for market stuff. That's really all I've been doing the last 2 weeks, to be absolutely honest. And Caleb sounds like he's been improving his Guild Island, so that's good because man, the Guild Island
finished
a lot of money.
I finished it finally.
You finished it finally. What's the last price on the last tier?
The last one was 6.5 million.
Oh my lord! Jesus. I don't know about that.
So it was a rush, right? I think all in all, is it about 10, right? When you do the 6 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 plus something. I think it sums up to about 10 million all in all.
Oh my god, that's way too much silver. Way too much.
And it's just if you don't do it now, right? If the gold price is going to escalate in the way that apparently it did in beta, it's just going to get more and more expensive. So I'd rather do it now than have to fight and do it later.
Yeah, that's true.
It's the same with personal islands, right? So we have basically been rushing to finish all the tiers, so we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, definitely. Also, today we're joined by Noizy Gamer. He's been playing for a little bit as well. The biggest reason that we have Noizy Gamer here today is he's basically an RMT kind of subject matter expert. All right, not just in Eve, but in other games as well. He's definitely been writing about it in his blog for years now concerning RMT subjects. So what have you been doing in game, Noizy?
Well, I got my personal island up to level 3. I'm now 30,000 silver away from level 4. I've got all the buildings that I built up to adept level, and I've got a farm and a pasture that I kind of shut down because Eve's pulled me away again because they're doing some crazy stuff.
That's true, man. I mean, to be honest, it's tough balancing. Really tough balancing my Eve time with Albion time, especially as when I try to focus on making videos.
Yeah, and you have to be careful in Albion because you don't want to leave your chickens and your goats hanging around because then they'll die. So you have to pull them in and things like that.
Do they really die? I didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure they die. I mean, they get hungry. I know that the people that do your buildings don't die, but I didn't want to take a chance on the goats, because because the goats give you all that good stuff, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had no more than 4 to 8 hours difference between playing and managing my farm, so. Okay, well, Thayer says animals don't die, so that's always good. All right, so animals don't die. Just feed them once, you get to go. All right, so the last 2 weeks, what have we been up to? Cause we kind of covered that already. So one of the main events that really caught my attention into probably getting someone like Noizy into the show was the value of the gold and silver conversions going over 500 silver. All right, so
so the global prices have gone up on pretty much everything.
Yes. The first time it happened earlier this week, and then almost immediately within a 24-hour period, it went right back down to 430 something. And then as of checking right now, pull up the picture here. We're sitting at 552 at the highest point within the last 24 hours.
Yeah, people cashed out, right?
Yeah, that's crazy. So what does that mean when it's affecting the global discount? So right now, at above 500, What's the state of NPC pricing, Caleb?
Well, it's just about 3-4% higher than normal globally. I think what's interesting here is that now we're kind of seeing the race where price to actually effectively plex or pay for your account with silver in game is just starting to skyrocket, and it's kind of Rush bringing in the same problem that you have in Eve these days, right? Where what was the quote from Jintan from the CSM minutes? Plex prices are too damn high. It's like, and now it's the same here, right? Silver is way too high. It's going to be more and more expensive to actually pay for your game time, or your premium at least. So I don't know what that's going to mean for player retention, but I'm hoping that Sandbox is aware that this could actually become a problem, especially when it relates to new players' access to things like premium. Otherwise, they're going to be second ranked citizens, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for player retention.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest concern on this one is how this actually plays out in not necessarily at the personal economy level, but more of the guild and alliance level. Like, what does this mean for buying city plots? What does this mean for being able to improve on your guild islands or your guild plots? You know what I mean?
Well, of course, guild. The rented plots in cities and stuff should follow the traditional hype cycle pricing, right? So you should start seeing it crash. But what's going to counter that development is the fact that the silver to gold conversion and the actual silver faucet in the game is going to make sure that it doesn't actually crash too crazy, because now the whole hype train has kind of left the station, and now we're supposed to figure out the normalization on prices on everything.
Yep. Any thoughts on that one, Noizy? Especially how effective of a premium currency is the gold and silver conversion you're thinking, Albion?
I mean, just like looking at this is like still early days in Albion, because it's the first 2 months, I think it is now. But I mean, it looks like it's working about as well as the WoW token did for WoW, or gems are doing in Guild Wars 2 or Plex and Eve. It seems that it's got that kind of vibe going. So I think it just needs to settle down. There's just right now, people are still deciding whether they want to play the game and things like that. So so I think it's going to take a while to actually settle down until it goes into probably a slow climb.
All right. I mean, as far as the actual concept, and in terms of potential, is this abusable? Is the gold silver mechanic? Where does that sit as far as security and safety in the RMT sense?
Well, you do have to worry about RMTers because they're basically built to, pull in a whole bunch of silver. So you have to worry about them trying to manipulate the market. Back in the day, back in EVE Online had a economist, a real full-time economist who's actually like running a university now, and so he created something called the EVE Central Bank, and this was there to intervene in the market if it looked like some funny business was going on. And when he introduced it, he explicitly mentioned RMT. In case somebody tried to manipulate it that way. So the same thing could happen here. I mean, I think it may have happened in EVE Online a couple times. It could happen in any game in which this is happening. So, as a model, it may not be the best, but it's better than anything else. Like it's a way superior to a company just selling game time for cash and making the cash up out of thin air.
Well, a player-traded economy when it comes to things like game time does actually have that the double-edged sword, right? It stabilizes it in the way that players and the market, the invisible hand, is basically figuring out the actual price, but it's also opening it up to extreme abuse when it comes to things like cornering. If there's a huge misbalance in things like the currency faucets in the game, and then of course, as Noizy points out, the whole RMT issue, if it's being used for things like that. This, especially the illegal RMT, of course, but I still think that the Albion Eve model has a lot more benefits than other games, and it stabilizes it in a way that makes it a lot more playable. I think the problem is really figuring out how to fix the in-game sinks and faucets on items and currency.
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
Because in Eve you have the what? Is it between 2 and 3% on month is the quote unquote inflation, or the increased availability of ISK in the game, right? So yeah, in Albion it looks as if it's a lot harder, right? It's a lot faster.
Well, the way that that Sandbox is trying to develop it, they're trying to make a player-run economy, in my opinion, a lot faster than what they did for what CCP did in EVE Online. And so you need to get that first initial rush of cash into the economy.
Agreed.
And also because it is, because you do have this rush, you got all these players coming up. Once the initial rush settles down, and hopefully that there will be a steady increase, and not like this tidal wave that comes in. Hopefully, then that way the money supply will match that on a per capita basis.
Yeah, it's just again, it has a similar issue or potential issue to things like stockpiles, right? Hoarding could become a huge problem in Albion, just like it is in EVE, and I think it is actually becoming that faster than EVE has, because it took EVE years to actually have considerable stockpiles, but now it's in crazy numbers, right?
Is that stockpile mostly because of respawn rates, or is it genuine stock, like hoarding behavior?
It's both. Now they turned down the boost in the last patch, right? So you no longer have that boost to nodes. So that might slow it down a little bit, but I still don't see how consumption can keep up and catch on to the current grind of just running and sucking on all those nodes.
Yeah, I mean, I did a study on the tier 3 and tier 4 raw and processed material pricing, and more than half of the actual list of categories are incredibly saturated. I think I can't remember what it was. I think it was one of the Rofs. I think it was travertine. The entire, at the time that I was doing the recording, the entire, or maybe it wasn't, but in one of those T4 processed items, the entire stock in all of Caerleon at that very moment in time was basically priced below the manufacturing cost of that reprocessed item.
Yeah, you're gonna see some sort of curve or availability of stock, almost as if it's the graphs of a gearbox in a car, right? As people progress into the tiers, you're going to see those things ramp up, and then you get the transition. And right now, because everyone has shifted from 3 to 4 and now from 4 to 5, you're just seeing that the availability of stocks is then changing at the same pace. So you're seeing 2 is kind of depleted, but 3 is heavily depleted, and then 4 is oversupplied, and 5 is beginning to be oversupplied. So it's a natural progression. It's just I don't necessarily see as I said, the consumption picking that up in a proper way, because you still need to skill on things, and then as prices settle way out in the future, I don't think they're going to settle properly until like 2 months from now. Then you're going to start seeing people being able to speculate on what gear they use and risk reward stuff in PvP, right?
Okay. So based on that kind of the gathering aspect of it, Noisy, what do you have any as far as observations on or you too, Caleb? I personally have not seen any bot activity in game or anything like that, but have you guys seen anything like that throughout your
There
history?
doesn't seem to be that much of it. There's the lock on, lock off abuse or whatever you want to call it, where people are basically parking at a node. It could be some sort of automated thing going on, but I think it's very small numbers now. I'm not entirely sure, but I would like to point out that I think one of the problems is that when you create the next tier up, you don't need the item from the previous tier. I think that could actually improve consumption a lot and might actually help balance things. So you need the lower tier, the tier 3 spear to actually get the tier 4 spears, including the components. So you add those labor hours as well, so you get a more stable economy.
You know, it's you know, because I've like seen the video. You know, I've seen videos of some sophisticated bots that are using that are also using the teleport function. I've personally witnessed a little macro. I don't even know if it qualifies as a bot or just a macro miner, where somebody parked their ox between two blocks of sandstone and was just having the macro go back and forth in an infinite loop, going back and forth between them. So you've got like the really simple stuff. You got some stuff that looks really advanced. I've seen a couple of sites that are basically saying that right now Albion is wide open to exploitation and bots like that.
I just don't agree because, as I've mentioned before, and I think we were talking about it when Fox4 was on, because of the dynamic spawn locations of nodes, even though he said that they are kind of fixed, as far as I can tell, they're really not. There might be locations in the entire map of each zone that you can say things can spawn in, but it's still all the tiers, right? So it shifts and either upgrades or downgrades depending on activity. So I don't think you can effectively create a good bot. You can do that, what you just mentioned, with the back and forth between two nodes, but eventually they're going to change and deplete or downgrade into, say, if it's tier 2 stone he's doing, it's going to downgrade into tier 1 stone, and then eventually it's going to disappear, right? That's what I see when I look at the map where the nodes are. So I think coding an efficient bot is really going to be difficult, also because the roaming of the mobs seems very difficult to predict.
Well, I think that, you know, I think what happens is that it's not going to be like easy botting like in EVE Online, where you've got your asteroid belt and you know to go there, or that you can that the anomalies are fixed and therefore you know what the damage types are, you know what the NPCs are going to spawn and everything like that. It's not that way, and the spawn points moving is a really good feature, and +1 to sandbox for doing that. That was really good. So it's not going to be easy, but can you do it? Yes, and it may be that instead of having something pre-written, that you have to like get to you have to actually find the location and then set up your bots to exploit that location. And if you have to do that, that's a lot more work for the RMT operator, for the botter, and that's less money in their pocket. And anything that makes the RMTer have to take time and miss making money is a good thing.
Yeah, and they've already managed to tank a little bit, right? They've been taking a beating from some of the decisions that Sandbox did when they decided to, what was it with the credit card thing? Could you elaborate on that?
Okay, with the credit cards. Okay, so I'm not gonna like pound on Sandbox for any kind of exploits going on or any kind of botting that's occurring. This is a brand new game. They are a company. They are an indie studio. They basically are. This is a crowdfunded game. So they got this. They got the small staff. So you have to cut them a little bit of slack. Also, with the credit cards. Oh, from just reading their outputs on the forums, what they published, it looks like they got hit big time. Um, when you hear about, when you hear like the officials from Sandbox on the forums talking about credit card fraud, the reason that they are so big on this is that there was a study last year, and credit card fraud, for every $1 credit card fraud that happens to a company, last year the average cost to that company was $2.40.
As far as recovering the lost money and effort, as far as implementing
Well,
new
well,
security tools.
no. Basically, what it was is, okay. So you go to like PayPal or you go to a credit card, and so so you say, okay, here is $100. This person purchased the maximum package. I can't remember the legendary package. Is it?
I think
So
so, yeah.
yeah. So they've purchased the legendary package. It costs $99.95. So the credit card company, so they put it to the credit card company. It was a stolen credit card, or so you have that, and it's like, oh, sorry, we're going to charge you because that's a stolen credit card. That's a bad thing. So not only do they take the $99.95 back, right? They're not going to pay the $99.95, but they're going to charge the company a fee for this. And so basically, not only are they having to give the $100 back, they also have to give back an additional fee, and that additional fee, I was a little bit unsure whether it's a $2.40 on top of the lost money, or if it's in addition to the lost money. So it's $100, and they're getting fined another $100. So instead of like getting the money that they thought, they're actually losing about that much money. So that hurts them financially bad, especially a small independent studio.
And there's really no way to preemptively like prevent this, is there?
I mean, for the way that they're instituting it with the starter packages, no, because you want to give the new user, you want them into your game right away, right? If you had like a starter package, and then there was no money in the starter package, and then that person had to go to the cash shop, you could like maybe delay that for 24 hours to make sure that the credit card actually wasn't stolen, and you can do your due diligence and everything. If you did it that way, yeah, there's a way to do it. But because of the business model that they're doing, they left themselves open to that.
Oh, that kind of sucks, man. I mean, because that gold that you get when you buy a founders pack, regardless of the value, I think the value did change depending on the type of founders pack you got. I mean, that's good for a real genuine player, but that's super harmful if you're an RM tier, right? Because now you just have more ammo in the system now.
Right. It's so basically what I mean. Okay, Sandbox's intentions and their reasoning was great. Okay, you have a player-run economy, so you need to kickstart it right away. So you have these starter packages, right? So that's number one. Number two, you can discourage RMT because you're giving people money right away, so they shouldn't need money right away, so they don't have to go off to a dodgy black market site, right? Excellent idea. There's something else that I forgot about, but it was a really good, well thought out plan, except for the fact that it didn't take into account that people are crooked, and that they will use credit card fraud, and they will use hacking. And not only, and we should say when we talk about the credit card fraud, it's not just the gold from the starter packages that are going into the game. It's also the game keys. And so the game keys are purchased with stolen credit cards, and then people will sell them to dodgy gray market sites. I'm not going to mention them. A couple of them are like well known. And so so what happens is they sell them to that site, and then players looking for a bargain will go to the gray market site where they buy the game keys. Then they come into Albion. They try to use those. Oh, sorry, they were purchased with stolen credit cards. We're not going to let that user come into the game, and then that causes lots of customer service headaches as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on with those stolen credit cards and other types of hacking that really make that the number one priority for Sandbox over fixing things like some of the exploits and the botting.
Yeah, it's true. As far as I'm not sure if you're familiar with this one, Caleb, but do you know of any of the security folks that are in SBI? Because I don't think they've been very vocal in the forums.
No, and I think it might also tie into the fact that, as already mentioned, Sandbox is a very new game and very new in the wild world of all these things. So they're just trying to slowly build their procedures and do the whole catch up, and how much are they going to log, and what AIs are they going to implement to actually discover all these types of exploits, and then of course what's the procedure going to be when they discover it. So I think that's why we haven't really seen any security team comments yet, except of course the comments from the CEO.
Yeah, it's true. Just to backtrack on an old story, but I just really would like to know your take on it. Noizy was, were you familiar with the Iron Bank situation a few weeks ago?
Oh yeah, I think that kind of helped make me want to write the piece that I did. Yeah, so basically, if I recall, you had a group of players that decided that they were going to like really play the financial system, and they ran into an RMTer who was going to use who wanted to use the market system, or the station system is what I think of it as a passive form of income. And so that whole back and forth was like really interesting.
It was an abuse of the auction system and the fact that that is a very primitive feature, and I hope Sandbox are considering how to improve it or do a better implementation of it, because I don't think that whole feature works.
It's a very interesting concept. It's almost like, I don't know, because I never played Star Wars Galaxies, but I get the feeling that it was kind of like it was kind of Star Wars Galaxy-ish, where you were actually bidding on territory within a city. The improvement on that I see from Albion, as opposed to other games that I've seen, is that their auction method makes sure that you don't have abandoned territory in the middle of your cities, and I think that was a positive on that mechanic.
I just think that it would be more useful to do something where it has an upkeep cost that is a little bit more harsh, and then make it a fully player-to-player based trade. I think that would be a lot better.
Yeah, that's true. You probably
Which again, it ties into the similar problem right now in E, right, with the proliferation of the upwell structures, that they do not have a proper upkeep cost. So the world is just scattered with them, and it's becoming a huge mess.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, sinks and faucets is a really good thing to address early on in your game because I think if you wait too long, it gets too big of a problem.
Yeah, and this ties into things like real estate or player-owned structures or player-owned land or whatever, sovereignty, all that stuff. They really need to have a model that makes sense and make sure that potentially it's as much in players' hands as possible, including the option to contest and compete with each other.
yeah. The only, I mean, I really like the idea that Sandbox thought about that, so that they don't have dead spots or like urban decay in the middle of their cities. The only thing that I don't like is the auction, because auctions are kind of iffy, and you can have people like say this isn't fair, that isn't fair, like we kind of like saw with the Iron Bank situation.
Now is
Yeah,
it?
it's exactly the same as with again, if you guys remember the worker thing in Eve Industry, where you could bid on the teams to put into your industry thing to boost it, right? Which was also based on an auction model, and it's just, I think we've seen so many times in games that auctions are exploitable and they don't really work. If you want to do something like that, make sure that it's handed over to players as fast as possible, is some sort of player created feature, and it has sinks and faucets, so and it incurs some sort of upkeep, and that means that it's going to enter into the player versus player market stuff, right?
So should the city plots, or are they better if they were actually contested through combat versus finances?
No, I don't think so.
Really?
I think they need to be contested by market competition, and then it becomes a totally different topic about how do you balance prices and market developments, and you're still going to see some sort of monopoly thing develop in most cities, and then you're in the whole feudal system problem with the upper echelons and the middle class and the noobs and the lower classes. How do you manage that? How do you balance that out? And there's no easy solution, and it's going to be fun to see what Sandbox decides to do when you start hitting that, because as it looks right now, it's going to be a lot more extreme in Albion than it is in Eve.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of discussion and these kind of issues are kind of like what drives me to want to be interested in Albion Online. To be honest, even if I haven't been in the game for a week or so, but yeah, it's these are the issues, and if you can have interesting issues like this where people who aren't even playing but they're still reading about your game, and they're interested in this kind of thing, that's kind of like what the kind of game that you actually want to have, an interesting game that people might want to drop into.
Yeah, and that's all tied into the fact that it needs to be a player versus player ecology all over the game, right? So this is really what I'm hoping to see, that Sandbox thinks about how to develop and add features, not necessarily to make it overly complicated, but make it more diverse and more variation, a little bit more complexity. It's too simple right now to have a healthy economy.
Well, is it because of the very linear production lines, you think? Does that have something to do with it?
It's the linearity. It's the lack of lateral integration, and it's the fact that price balance wise, when it comes to things like building times and requirements to create items and stuff like that, all these numbers are kind of very exponential and very traditional level based, and it's really bad. It's going to create an excessive Gini coefficient, really, the difference between poor and rich people.
Well, probably the other side of the spectrum of the way the production line works in Albion that I can think of, at least the games that I've experienced, would be something like how production happened in Arcade. It was completely random.
Yeah, I don't like randomized randomized system just makes it even worse. I think it's about variables and making sure that the player actions are, well, the system is so sensitive to players' actions that you create too much chaos, too many variables for anyone to spreadsheet their way out of it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I guess really the only place you could really attack that would be the folks who live primarily in the black zones, I would imagine. I think attacking it at I think attacking the city dwellers may be a bit too strong.
Yeah, the cross dependency between the black zones and what is equivalent to the secure space, the cities. I think that idea is pretty good. It's just all the ideas in Albion are good, but they're very rough, and it looks as if they were afraid of complexity and too much lateral integration or interdependence. So they've kind of simplified it, and that makes sense initially, but they definitely need to widen it out a bit and make sure that that player behavior really makes it impossible to just have this exponential development of the economy.
Yeah. I mean, shit, man. I mean, just looking at the market itself, like simple things like market history, it's non-existent in game unless you have the tools to actually look at it.
Well, like the funny thing is something regarding trophies, right? So trophies boost yields of laborers in houses, right? And the overproduction right now of something like T2 and T3 trophies is just ridiculous, right? It's a massive number of overproduced items of that type to boost your housing, and that's just not a very balanced way of doing it. And then the fact that you can't actually sink it back out, so you can't recycle it like you can with a lot of other items. So you just have this overstock of stuff that's never going to be used. It's a little bit like, I think it's eggs, right? Where there's like an infinite amount of eggs, and I think it's butter too. There's like it's not balanced in consumption, and that's the problem. They need to figure out how to have the right faucets and sinks on all types of production.
So does that level of saturation offer itself a way to RMT out the money from the system and into actual real money where people can like live off of unscrupulously?
I mean, the saturation probably, okay, so when you look at RMT and you look at things like that, the RMT will actually help. In some ways, the RMT will lead to material faucets being way too fast because people will do things like bot and things like, will do things like bot in order to increase not only their skills, but also the amount of material they have to sell. And like we saw in EVE Online back in the day, they would just keep going flat out, and they didn't really care about the prices. So they would like actually cause the saturation and not really care. As long as their stuff was selling, they were fine.
Yeah, the problem always seems to be the two main things, right? Bots, automation, and AFK faucets, right? These two things always break the games.
Yeah, so if you have a game that really relies on the economy, like in EVE Online and what it looks like Albion Online is trying to do, then you really have to be careful. If you have games that they don't really give a damn, like Guild Wars 2 at launch, it was like that economy was just totally screwed from the beginning until they actually put in artificial floors for item costs.
Yeah, and it ties into what we talked about a little bit before we went live. Is there a theoretical or utopian solution to all these economic balance problems with MMOs and sandbox oriented games? And I honestly think that the only way to resolve any of these problems is to take it up a notch. So basically, maybe even legalize RMT and have banks in the real world or at least to some extent, financial institutions in the real world show an interest in these games and help manage and create policies in game design, and then sort of a certification. So if you're certified, so a game like Albion might be a certified game because they're actually trying to balance it. A game like, well, World of Warcraft and maybe a game like EVE Online, these games would then be certified by the financial sector, and they would then allow for cross-currency trade and in and out RMT.
When you say cross currency, you mean taking WoW currency into EVE currency into Albion currency and just have them
pretty much. I'm saying that
value.
It takes X hours to legally play to Plex in EVE. It takes X hours to legally play in Albion to silver pay for your account, so on and so forth. So the effective cross-currency price should be based on that. How much money in the game can you make per tick? And that would then be the conversion rate, because an hour would be an hour whether you're playing one game or the other. And then that means that if you can make 150,000 silver in Albion, and I can make, what's the tick in EVE at the moment, 80 million per hour or something like that, then that's the conversion, right? You get that much for the silver in Albion. And then with fees and all that stuff and security and third partying and all that, right? That would be what the bank in real life would then offer the clients, right?
You know, this was like a hot topic on podcasts back in like 2009, 2010 about real money like this. And one of the things that came up was the government interference in the games, because once you start talking about bringing real money out, that's going to lead to governments wanting their cut of the pie.
Yeah, of course. If you're taking money out, that could potentially be considered an earning, and then you would pay your tax in the respective country. But there's no difference between doing that in games and then me hiring Rodin for a job and paying him with eBay or whatever type of payment, or even I could even potentially pay him in some obscure game currency and consider the conversion rate. And tracking all this activity is really not what should be discussed, because that's up to the individual countries, up to something like the financial sector to actually figure out how to do that. And when money moves from an account, say an Albion account, and into your real money account on your credit card, that's where the real taxation then becomes a thing. But the other way is also true. You could also have a taxation in an MMO to work as a sink. How do you then legally then deduct that from your potential earnings into real life money? It's a whole mess, and we need to start talking about this in a serious way, because it is going to be reality 10 years, 20, 25 years from now. So the financial sector needs to actually wake up and start looking at these things and take it serious.
So when you say that this potentially could be a real life thing we must address, are you talking like cryptocurrencies and things like that? They would just have the same relative value?
No, well, cryptocurrency is a little bit of a pet hate of mine. I think there's still way too subculture, or whatever you want to call it, underground, right? I don't like them. I don't trust them, and I think they reek of scam. The fact that something like Bitcoin, it looks as if the creators basically held on to like half the actual created Bitcoins for themselves. So it's basically a pump and dump and borderline a Ponzi scheme. But there is value in the cryptocurrency method and the system for real financial activity. But I'm thinking games are different. They are based on things like voluntary used hours of work or leisure, and that then generates a different type of currency that's not necessarily it's not service rendered, it's entertainment invested, or something like that. So
Fun received.
Well, you're moving it. It's also an anti. It's almost like an anti-currency, right? It's something that you can exchange, and it doesn't actually have a potential real life purchasing value. But as you reach abundance economies in more and more nations across the globe, which is going to be a fact, and you're seeing the energy revolution is very, very close now, right? Then these things need to be considered, because people will volunteer their labor to things that doesn't necessarily generate physical real value. What it generates is immaterial and entertainment value and attention economy. And that's really something that the big wigs need to consider, because that is going to be the majority of the economy 25, 50 years from now.
That's crazy.
You know, I'll just say this. I don't see game companies wanting to do this, because it's not going to bring them in any more money, but it is going to increase their personnel costs, because they're going to have personnel to go ahead and process all the tax stuff, that's tax regulations. If you go across countries, you're going to have to deal with all the different country regulations. I see that being, for the game companies themselves, more of a pain than it's going to be worth.
Well, you're sort of counter arguing from tradition, which makes it a fallacy, right? Because yes, you're right in the current economy, but I'm not talking about the current economy, because your workers in a game company is going to be more and more interested in the type of value that is created in the attention economy, because the material economy is going to have less and less of an importance in the overall global economy. So the employee of, say, Sandbox now, whether that's Grayscale or whatever, he is most likely going to be spending most of his value in real life when he's doing purchases. They're going to be oriented towards attention economy, leisure economy, immaterial economy. So if the players are creating and paying and interacting with that kind of currency, him being paid in the same makes perfect sense. I'm saying we need to consider where is money moving in the next 100 years. And yes, of course, right now, game companies are not that interested in it, but they are the experts, right? They are the only ones that know about how these things are going to work.
But you are totally disregarding the effect of governments and government regulation on things like this, and just the regulatory burden that would be placed on game companies with this kind of thing, with all these national governments that you have to pay, would just go ahead and make it, no, this isn't worth it.
Yeah, and of course you're right, but it's exactly like piracy in the past, right? You have a period where it's underground, where it's kind of illegal and criminalized, and then eventually the business itself is going to pick up the same type of ideas and models, and that's how you go from peer-to-peer sharing, direct connect, torrents, all these things into then Netflix today, right? That's really the progression, and it's the same you're going to see in what would be considered finance when you're dealing with the immaterial value creation.
That's crazy,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah, and I'll just say this: it's like the private sector can be as innovative as hell, and but it doesn't matter, because then the government comes in and will quash it. And if it comes to be a point where you're going to just go, where you're going to go for the most profit, and if government's going to come in and just smash you if you do this, then that's the incentive to go away from it.
True, but you have to consider that the governments usually are just acting on behalf of who pays their bills, right? So, of course, they might have an overall interest, but the majority of lobbyism come from the existing status quo, the corporations, the business, the economy as it is, and disruptive elements are trodden, right? They do not have a voice, but eventually the underground will actually move up. That's why you had these draconian policies from governments when it comes to things like copyrights and patents and all these things. But we've reached critical mass where it's no longer efficient for society to keep up with this. So even though you still have the draconian laws in most nations when it comes to copyright and patents, it's not really enforced because it's no longer efficient, because you have patent trolling, you have excessive remixing, you have all these things on the internet that's impossible to unravel, and most of it's not even leaving an economic footprint. So how do you police that? And I think it's going to be the same when it comes to immaterial economy in the attention and creative economy. It's going to be impossible to follow. We are very close to having, as I said, energy abundance and things like 3D printing and extremely cheap production. When we reach that point, things need to be think all the way.
All right, I'm going to use that as a quick segment or segue into. I've actually just linked into Twitch chat a link to Bogle's investment plan. And I'm using that basically every time we have the topic of RMT, almost always you can follow it up with some sort of investment in games. And I find this very, very interesting because I've done investment type activities in other games as well. I haven't done it in Albion though yet. But the optics sometimes behind certain investment activities and RMT gets really, really blurry. And I kind of just want to address that. If you guys have any experience with in-game type investments that actually had an RMT facet to it, or kind of developed it because of the way things were going, is this something that should be promoted, investments in games, because of the very sandbox nature of it? Or what do you guys think about that whole mess?
I'm very pro investments in game, as you know, since I'm actually running an investment fund. But the problem is that if you consider things like the hype cycle, if you're still in a hype cycle economy, you can't really make a really good investment model because you're basically potentially on the way down into the trough, right? So this is also why in Eve, what you do when you build a model, of course you have the mechanics that can then create the revenue and the return of investment. But when it's investment and speculation based, you have to wait for the new things to happen so you can actually get on the other side of the trough where things then start being volatile and start moving up into the natural level of pricing. And I don't think we're there in Albion yet. So this is potentially, as far as I can tell, only a mechanics-based thing that's sucking a specific faucet in the game, and then you're building a business model on that. And I don't think that's a very stable business model. I think it's a little bit risky.
Specifically, Bogle's plan.
No, I don't think it's necessarily bad. It's just that it's extremely sensitive to divine intervention. I think I mentioned that when I wrote the business plan for the investment fund in Eve, that it is extremely sensitive to what CCP does, just like Bogle's investment is extremely sensitive to what Sandbox does. If they change any balance in the game, that could potentially rip his business plan apart.
Wow, yeah, that's true. So, I mean, as far as my experience with investments, it's just I'm a market guy. I flip items. All right, give me money and I'll give you the, I'll double your risk.
You're a broker.
I know, exactly, a broker. So, I mean, where does it, if I was part of the game developing team and I did not have a whole lot of actual experience in finance, or kind of just general economics, am I in a pretty bad spot because now I may be impeding on genuine sandbox gameplay that I probably should just let be?
Yeah, this is...
Then you're back to Dr. E, right? You're back to the Dr. E question.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think Noizy almost said so earlier. As a game progresses into a more complex economy in the game, in the sandbox, they need more and more experts to actually help balance. They can't just expect the player base to figure it out, especially because they're more likely to be breaking your game than balancing your game.
Yeah, players are going to break the game. Players are going. Let's not call it break. Let's call it they are going to wring every last silver and copper out of the game that they can.
True.
If there's a hole in the law, or if there's a flaw in your economic system, they will find it and they will break it, just like in real life.
So I'm again going to use that as a segue to another question for you guys. If you're serious about developing a game that takes advantage of the open world sandbox nature of people that want to play games, how much attention should you really be putting on the financial aspect of the game, the market side of the game? Because a lot of times that tends to be such an afterthought.
Yeah, I think if they don't put in really a lot of thought into how to balance it, and then we get into the whole ecosystems and using ecosystem science and Lockable Terror models and predator-prey models and all these things that we know about in real life and how the physical world works. If they don't think of these things, you should actually consider it slightly or borderline a pump and dump product, and it's not going to get 10, 15 years. True, CCP have not actually been extremely good at balancing the ecosystem, but at least they've been tweaking it and fixing it along the way. So that's more repairing than designing. And I think if a new game developer does not actually design from the beginning, it reeks a little bit of that they're not taking it that serious.
Yeah, I mean, one of my biggest fears, honestly, when it comes to in the very beginning of my MMO playing, time, would be anytime someone mentions big amounts of money in a game, regardless of the context. Honestly, I would almost immediately think this is RMT of some sort. I just don't know why, but it's RMT of some sort. And I don't know. That's a pretty bad stigma, So I'm not sure how we can get beyond that if we actually can.
I don't know if you can get beyond that with the huge amounts of money. The best that you can do, I think, is actually have it so that the game company itself is dominating the RMT market and not the third-party services who are going to be doing bad things in order to get the money. I think that competition is good for the player, at least because what you want to do is you're never going to eliminate it. And this probably will surprise people hearing me say that. You're never going to eliminate it. But what you can do is you can try to limit the amount of unsanctioned RMT. Basically, think of the game company as a bunch of janitors, and they're trying to mop up the mess faster than it comes out of the sewer.
Yeah, I suppose that's. I mean, that's true though. You can never really get rid of it because, I mean, when it comes to like that arms race between the RMTers and the game company and the innocent players that get caught in between, it's such a shit show. It really is, man.
It's because you have that meta layer on MMOs, right, where people are investing time and actually want to play the game, and that means there's value there, but it's value that cannot be controlled, so it's always going to be abused until it is somehow regulated and legalized.
I mean game companies can control somewhat. Basically what they need to do is they need to try to make it as unprofitable as possible, and unfortunately at the beginning of a game's lifetime you can't do that because the gold or silver it's gonna be worth so much more on day one than it is on day 365, and 2 or 3 years down the line. I mean, you see that in every game. I mean, like what Eve did, what CCP did, and what Albion's doing with gold, the gold silver. it basically puts a cap on the amount of money that the RM tiers can charge. So you've got that limit. So hopefully you can get the amount, you can keep the amount that they're charging your players down, and then hopefully their costs of doing business are going to be high enough that people just want to go to a different game in order to make their money, because they'll be able to make more money on a different game.
It's kind of funny because it all ties into the eternal problem of the sandbox, is that because all these games right now are using that faucet and sink method of putting things into the game. You mentioned the actual silver and how you need to get to a certain level where there's X amount of silver in the game, so that can be used for the market and the exchange of goods. But the problem is that these faucets never seem to turn off, and in the real world, no matter is created or destroyed, it's only converted, right? There's a finite amount of energy and matter in the universe, and ideally that's what you should have in a sandbox. You should actually need to theoretically you should need to mint money in the game physically to actually create the legal tender, right? And it's the same with everything else. When something gets created, it needs to be converted, not created. If you have creation and destruction, if those two are not ideally balanced equally, you will have an inflationary system and game. And then you start having the things with pricings and valuation of people's time and the whole meta layer and RMT, and it's unavoidable. So they need to think of this from a very high macro level, otherwise they will never find the solutions.
Well, could one potential part of the solution be an actual mechanic of degradation? Things, you're forcing things to eventually not exist anymore. Does that...
Yeah, of course. Cyclicals always help, right? If you have something that's depletable, something that's a non-replenished source and things like that, it's also always going to be a benefit if you add stuff like that into the game. It's going to be very complicated to do so in a decent way.
I mean, a sandbox seems to be doing something like that right now, because like once the exchange rate is over 500 silver for a gold, then the amount of upkeep costs and repair costs and everything like that goes up and up. So they're doing something similar to that to try to increase the silver faucets. And decrease the silver sink, or increase the silver sink as there's more money in the economy. So they're trying to do something like that. How much they're going to actually succeed, we don't know, because we don't have that kind of statistic right now. We can just basically look at prices. But they're at least to their credit, they're trying to do something like that.
I think what's more to their credit is that it looks as if they've tried to create the system so it's detached from what would be considered the NPC seeds and things like the faucets and sinks. So eventually they are going to turn off the training wheels, and everything is going to eventually be in the hands of the players. So there's going to be, well, maybe not perfect, but near perfect balance between how much silver is created by the game engine and how much is going to get taken out, right? So then it's up to the players to put the value and the price on the specific items in the game. And that's going to be based on supply and demand. It's just that we still have a very, very clunky system to manage a market. So it's going to be a little bit uphill because they don't have a complicated market system and exchange like they do in EVE. They have a few advantages that EVE does not have, like infinite orders and call it the granularity of the different areas where you can actually have markets, right? The different cities, the black zones, the guild islands, and all this. So there's a little bit of an advantage there. It's just that until we get some sort of market API or whatever, I don't see this stabilizing in a nice way.
Dang. Well, SBI's ability, at least based on kind of how I see the interface in the game, it do they or do they not have more positive control over the actual gold and silver exchange versus, say, Plex in Eve?
Both, right? They have a benefit of more control. Again, like we talked about in an earlier episode, it's as if they can kind of do the central banking thing because it's kind of behind this fog of war. You can't see market depth. You don't know who's actually trading anything. So it's kind of like, I think it's the World of Warcraft tokens, right? You can't really know what the actual price finding is and whether Sandbox is actually generating silver or gold out of thin air, right? You can't really know that. That's the benefit because they can control prices. They don't need something like a stock of Plex like you do in Eve, where if CCP wants to cool the market, they actually need to use confiscated Plex. Because if they start creating it out of thin air to do price manipulation, that would undermine the entire benefit of having a player traded and player price finding mechanic. So it's both good and bad.
Yeah, I mean they can use the system and they can like behind the scenes set a like basically let's call it a tax rate where they can like increase and decrease the silver sync that transaction has. So there's so you can like say, okay, at this point we need it to be 10%. Maybe next month we need it to be 20%. Then it's backing off, so we can make it 15%. So they've got that capability, and you don't have that in like in EVE Online. You also basically you have that in every other game except for EVE Online. Albion was going to be like the second game where you had direct token trading, like from silver to gold, or like Eve has ISK to Plex. But when the RMT just became too much, and they eliminated the direct selling of gold to silver, they basically went to the system that every other game has gone to.
Yeah, it's kind of a cop out, right? It's because, well, I still think they still want to do what Eve has done and create a proper sandbox thing. It's just that they are kind of trying to do that way too fast, and they're not letting things develop naturally. And when it comes to the RMT and botting and abuse problem, I think that that problem is so much larger these days than it ever was in the ancient time of Eve. So they're suffering from a problem that Eve never had to struggle with to the same extent. I think they've been doing a good job. It looks as if they're actually aware of it and trying to plug those holes. It's just that designing the actual game while you're trying to defend yourself against RMT and abuse, it's an uphill battle, right?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you directly, Noizy, since you're definitely in the you share the same you're in that RMT circle, right? As far as the types of websites that you look into or different source information, where does Albion actually kind of rank as far as how like RMT or botter friendly it is from your experience?
Okay, so without going into great detail, because this may get picked up on Sandbox's official Twitch channel, I hear that you're kind of popular with them. I don't want to like be doing anything that might advertise any of these sites. I do it on my blog, but CCP's been kind of okay with it. I've had some fans over there, but there is one site. It's been running for 20 years. It's been mentioned by the BBC. It's been mentioned by the New York Times. I've seen mentions in several academic papers about this site. So it's a major site. The day before the gold to silver direct trading was banned, it ranked number 10th in popularity on that site. As of, I think it was last week, about maybe 10 days ago, it had dropped off the top 20 list. So whatever happened, And you could say it's maybe players leaving because of the DDoS. You could say it's a definite. I would say it's definitely Sandbox's hardcore stance that if you buy once, that you're permanently banned and you lose your account, and you lose your at least $30, if not $99.95 that you spent on initially. That's a hazard that most players aren't going to want to take. The professional RMTers will, but your average player that just wants to log in and play the damn game, they're not going to take that. And because of that, I think it's really lowered the popularity and the desire of players to go ahead and buy silver, especially in comparison to all the other games out there.
Just in comparison, how does CCP's Eve actually rank on that side?
It went down to 15.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, when Eve went free to play, or gave the free to play option, it actually went from like 12th or 13th up to 8th.
Wow.
And then, yeah, because free to play, as soon as you have free to play, you have lots of RMT. That's just a guarantee that's going to happen. But over the course of time, it's gone down to 15th. I don't think it's necessarily because of a greater enforcement, although I've been seeing lots of ban waves and stuff. But I think it's other games. People are like going away from games like Eve, where people are based. Let's face it, the Eve kind of has a reputation of being Nazis about this, and so they're just going to other games where they can make more profits, and so that there's more people trying to sell and there's more people buying.
That's good though. I'm very surprised that Albion was able to basically get off the list, get off the hit list. That's really, really good. I'm sure that's a combination of things, from the very aggressive anti-botting, anti-RMT, kind of seeking out, I mean, I'll be honest, like, I'll be in Carleon and in local chat, nothing like that. Nothing like, click on www blah 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 for selling gold. Nothing like that, man. It's crazy.
Yeah, and every game has that, where the RMTers, the sellers, go ahead and do things like that. I think that it may be, if the RMTers are not doing that, that indicates one of two things, or maybe both. One is that the devs have gotten their filters aligned, because if you're a small company, you don't know what's going to happen, and so it takes you a while to figure out what your filters need to be in order to get rid of that. That's number one. And number two, it could be that they're doing a better job on the stolen credit card front, because they could be making sure that people aren't getting in with the stolen credit cards, because a lot of the